All right, welcome back for our second roundtable session, which is Religion and the State. Some of you will have noticed that Peter Lake is not here. He's canceled only just on Monday, which did not leave me time to find a replacement. But you'll be happy to know that I have located a Peter Lake costume. Yeah, so I'm going to refrain from unbuttoning my shirt, fiddling with my hair either on my head or my chest, putting marbles in my mouth, or staring out the window while I speak. But I am going to add some early modern remarks in Peter's place, and I will act as a semi-participant as well as a commentator, as a moderator for this session. But let me first introduce the three proper participants. I'm not really going to wear this. In no yeah, all right. In no particular order, Calum Brown is Professor of Religious and Cultural History at the University of Dundee, where he arrived in 2004 after 19 years at the University of Strathclyde. His first book, The Social History of Religion in Scotland, was published in 1987, and since then he's written numerous other books on religion, on popular culture, on gender, as well as theoretical work on postmodernism. And his most famous work, The Death of Christian Britain, a truly important work, was first published in 2001 and is now, I'm happy to say, published in a splendid second edition.
Expanded and well worth the...
Jane Shaw, the Reverend Canon Dr. Jane Shaw, I should say, is Reader in Church History and Chaplain and Dean of Divinity at New College, Oxford. She received her Master's in Divinity from Harvard and her PhD in History here at Berkeley. She's the author of two books, Culture and the Nonconformist Tradition, 1999, and Miracles in Enlightenment England, 2006. Also, wearing a somewhat different hat, she writes a regular column on religion for The Guardian and is intimately involved in the contemporary politics of the Anglican Communion as, and this really does come from your Wikipedia site, the theological consultant to the House of Bishops of the General Synod of the Church of England. Frank Pawhuska is lecturer and senior research scientist at Yale University. He received his PhD from my old stomping ground, Northwestern University, somewhat before I taught there, after which he taught at numerous universities, both in the US and the UK, including the University of Wisconsin and the University of London. And he's written, depending on how you count, somewhere between 6 and 10 books on various aspects of philanthropy, charity, and public welfare in Britain, most recently, Christianity and Social Service in Modern Britain, The Disinherited Spirit, Oxford, 2006. Now, since chronologically speaking, I go first, I'm going to go first with my remarks. And in fact, I'm going to be the only early modernist in a sense, because Jane is going to be doing wearing her modernist hat for at least her initial comments. So let me represent early modernity here. For any early modernist, I think, the big frame for the question of religion and the state is the assumption of the royal supremacy over the Church of England in 1534. And that coup d'etat replaced the government of the Church with the government of the civil state and made ecclesiastical officers, like bishops, ministers, and college heads, into civil servants. And of course, figuring out exactly what it meant for the state to control the Church drove much of the political narrative of England over the subsequent 150 years, leading roundabout to 2 different revolutions, and also drove much of the political narrative in Scotland in the sense that the authority of the Kirk was successfully maintained its independence from the authority of an aggressive Stuart state. But the crucial issue here, it seems to me, is that church and state is not and never can be the same as religion and the state, which is the title of this panel, and which is what I want to talk about for a few minutes. Most early modern observers, however strong their support for the royal supremacy over the Church, would have granted the state only the most rudimentary or supervisory authority over what they called religion, which was at least in large part a private internal matter between the believer and God. Even Richard Hooker, who wrote that the Church was simply a name given to the Commonwealth when it acted for the exercise of Christian religion, and whom we might take as the poster child for the limitation of religion to the positive laws of the state, nonetheless saw those laws as the product of true religion rather than their source. Law for him was the conscience of the nation, an idea that goes back to Thomas Aquinas. Since religion was in that sense autonomous rather than subservient, Hooker imagined circumstances when civil laws, as enactments of public conscience, might be used to compel the royal government to act in Christian ways. So again, religion has an autonomous existence that's not bound by the church-state dynamic. More broadly, almost all early modern thinkers posited an autonomous sphere of religion over which the state had no jurisdiction. Roger Lestrange, the great opponent of religious toleration in Charles II's reign, responded to demands for freedom of conscience by saying, essentially, you already have freedom of conscience. What human being could possibly take it from you? On the opposite side of the ecclesio-political fence, Puritans of all stripes regarded religion as an internal faith that manifested itself in outward regeneration, and as such they saw the state as at best the protector and at worst the persecutor of religion, but never as a source or authority for religion. In other words, in one sense, the title of this roundtable, Religion and the State, can be seen as an oxymoron, or at least a very limited sphere of inquiry, and we might posit that our own desire to see religion and the state as a significant issue is a product of our own secular humanist training, a quintessentially late modern, post-Enlightenment reduction of religion to base externalities rather than lively saving faith. This is me channeling both Peter Lake and the Elizabethan Puritan thought police. Having said that, however, let me of course add that I am indeed a secular humanist, in fact a downright impious one, and to me what's interesting is precisely the limitations of that purist claim for the autonomy of religion, and the tensions that were created time and time again when religion, in that pure, abstracted, conscientious sense, confronted the sordid, messy realities of the early modern state. For the fact is, at certain moments, all of these early modern observers, even the most radical Puritans, were forced by expediency or necessity to bend their convictions and admit that, yes, indeed, the state is a big deal in religion. One great example is John Winthrop at the trial of Anne Hutchinson. When he accused Hutchinson of aiding and abetting heretics, she answered, "That's matter of conscience, sir," to which Winthrop replied, quote, "Your conscience you must keep, or it must be kept for you." Now, the gendered aspect of this claim is perhaps worth underlining, since a similar need for male authority to govern female spirituality was both a commonplace of gender relations in the period and a common metaphor more broadly for the role of the state in religion. But my favorite example is William Penn, at times the most eloquent spokesman for the idea that religion is purely internal, the light within, utterly outside state jurisdiction. At other times, Penn demanded that the state institute draconian penalties for impiety, essentially walling off an internal sphere of religion, precisely so that, and here I'm quoting my colleague Jonathan Sheehan, precisely so that he could hide behind that wall of separation while he lobbed grenades into the creeping secularism outside. Listen to William Penn's advice to Charles II, and this is rather a long quotation, but it says a lot of what I want to say. This is him speaking to Charles. "Be pleased to consider your commission and examine the extent of your authority. You will find that God and the government hath empowered you to punish these impieties, and it is so far from being a crime that it is your duty. This is not troubling men for faith, nor perplexing people for tenderness of conscience, for there can be no pretense of conscience to be drunk, to whore, to be voluptuous, to game, to swear, to curse, to blaspheme, and profane. No such matter. These are sins against nature and against government, sins against government, as well as against the written laws of God. 'Twas to prevent these enormities that government was instituted, and shall government indulge that which it is instituted to destroy? This were to render magistracy useless, and the bearing of the sword in vain. There would be then no such thing in government as a terror to evildoers, but everyone would do that which he thought right in his own eyes. God Almighty defend us from this anarchy." Now, these were the words of the 17th century's greatest defender of the independence of religion from the state. So it seems to me that the subject, religion and the state, then is and has to be a real and important subject for at least early modern historians. But it's an important subject precisely because it reveals to us important instances of category confusion and rhetorical sleight of hand as our subjects mobilized different, often conflicting visions of religion for contingent political purposes. So when we consider this subject, we need to resist the temptation, I would say, to tacitly prejudge exactly what we take religion to be, and indeed exactly what we take the state to be, no matter how much we might be tempted in other circumstances to try to define it closely. Because the plasticity of these concepts is precisely the heart of the matter, what allowed them to interweave together in these complex and, in the end, deeply contradictory ways. Okay, those are my 2 cents. Jane?
Okay. I'm going to talk about the established church, given that Ethan outed me as an Anglican priest, which I hadn't really intended to be outed as, but that now you know, So it makes sense that I'm going to talk a bit about the established church and the fuzziness of the boundaries between I suppose the state religion as a concept and the established church. That's the first thing I want to talk about. And how the established church functions culturally, if you like, how it creates cultural power. So, first of all, one of the ways you can get at how people conflate is the established church and state religion, and what that conflation might do culturally, is to read some of the hysterical rhetoric about disestablishment. So in 1893, there was a bill attempting to start the process of disestablishment in Wales. It didn't get anywhere. They had to wait till the second decade of the 20th century to do that. But on the 10th Sunday after Trinity in 1893, so in the middle of the summer when parish attendance was probably a bit sleepy, a young curate in Dover named Arthur Boltrop preached a rousing, well, in fact, very long-winded sermon on the dangers of establishment, hoping to whip up support because he was extremely worried about this bill and the possibility of disestablishment in Wales, and also hoping to whip up funds for the Church Defence Institution, which he said was only pulling in £8,000 a year at the time. And he argued that if there was to be disestablishment, then there would be national apostasy. Disestablishment for him was about the repudiation of religion. He wrote, or preached rather, if religion were to be separated from the state and its functions by law, apostasy would be the result. For to shut out religion from the great affairs of this world is in principle atheism. He then went on to list the various ways in which religious ceremony would be banished from all state occasions, the coronation, no chaplain in Parliament, and so on. And so far, you could say so standard in his arguments. You could find plenty of other people who said this too. But you can see how there's this conflation of, well, disestablishment means this about the state and religion. He then went on to provide almost a kind of proto-Eltonian idea about the church's influence on state government, interestingly. And there's a nice glimpse of how someone in the late 19th century thought about the 16th century church. He wrote, the idea of state government was largely borrowed from the church's administration of her own affairs. The church is the spiritual mother of the state, and you cannot separate the two without involving the possible disintegration of both. Our national bliss is bound up with our national religion. So this is a kind of emotional tying of things. Nearly 110 years later, a less obscure cleric, George Carey, then retiring as Archbishop of Canterbury, chose St. George's Day to say something remarkably similar, that disestablishment would lead to the collapse of civilized society. That was his language. The comments he made may have been prompted by the fact that his successor had been appointed, and that was a man who was Archbishop of Wales, and of course the church in Wales had been disestablished. But obviously, in this 110 years that divided these two sets of comments that were remarkably similar, many things had happened. The Church of England had its own Parliament synod, which meant it mostly looked after its own affairs. The parish system was not the same as it had been 110 years earlier. Anglican vicars do indeed work alongside leaders of other religious communities and of course nonconformists. More recently, the Prime Minister now is no longer involved in the appointment of bishops and deans through number 10 Downing Street. Gordon Brown said he didn't want anything to do with that. And looking to the future, bishops are not guaranteed any place in the Reformed House of Lords. And interestingly, this gives another little clue into this sort of tying of these things. 5 years later, in 2007, George, by now, interestingly and importantly, Lord Carey, said that if bishops were no longer given a place in a future version of the House of Lords, then the Church of England should seek disestablishment. So there's this interesting idea that if we have an entirely elected upper chamber, then that will have already signalled for Lord Carey the end of civil or civilised society. So you may as well go for broke and have disestablishment. So there is this idea that the established church is what provides a spiritual underpinning to society, and it does that weirdly, so these comments suggest, through state religion. I want to complicate the picture slightly by thinking of what we would now call the Anglican Communion, so the churches in the colonies and white settler colonies, as well as places like India and Africa. Just two examples. In 1912, the Indian Church, the Church of England in India, if you like, got its own first time Indian bishop, as opposed to a British man being brought out to India to be a bishop. The Church of England is evolving into the Church of India, said a delegate at a meeting. And in 1927, royal assent was given to the Indian Church Bill, and so the Indian Anglican Church assumed governance of its own affairs, 20 years before Home Rule. So there's an interesting division there between when some of these churches become independent, but when the state becomes self-ruling. And then in various colonial contexts, you can see that the relationship is, again, complicated, because there may be that the Church of England is not the official state church, but it functions like that in terms of social capital, if you like. That would be true in Australia, I think. So that every establishment figure is, of course, Anglican in Australia, but they didn't quite go, they just stopped short of saying it's the state church. That's the first set of comments. Second set of comments, which I suspect may or may not tie in with what Calum's going to say, is about secularization and the role of established religion in the fraught relationship, as we think about secularization, between patterns of church-going, religious practice, and the question of belief. Many of you will know the work of sociologist Grace Davey, who has attempted to track and name patterns of church-going and belief in post-war Britain. And she's introduced two important concepts to the literature. The first is believing without belonging, that sociologists have traditionally counted numbers of heads in church, but actually that doesn't necessarily tell us the first thing about belief, right? And then she's also talked about vicarious religion, namely that there's a sort of, designated group of people who still are familiar enough with, a few hymns and prayers, that they can plug in, this will run out in time, that they can plug into what's going on when they walk into a church. But what really happens is that the established church in particular, and Calum, I've got to say I'm talking only about the established church in England at the moment. I know there's a different one in Scotland, okay. That the established church in a way particularly provides the underpinning of that. But I have, from my own research in the 1920s and 30s, I've begun to think that we should, for that period, for the pre-World War II period, reverse Davies' first formulation, believing without belonging, to suggest something about the relationship between secularization and the established church. I have come to think that I want to talk about belonging without believing now, because I think one of the things that the role of the Church of England has distinctively established is that people went to church as a form of duty, particularly, and this is particularly through the Church of England, but that they could believe any number of things or nothing. And the reason I've come to this conclusion is I've been writing for the last few years the history of a very unusual and heterodox religious community from the 90s and 20s and 30s in England. And there are hundreds, thousands of letters that I've made my way through in the archives of people writing in, and some of them join and some of them don't join. But what they have provided me with is this amazing insight into what people believed. And so time after time, I read these letters, and most of them come from people who go to the Church of England every Sunday, but don't in any way believe what you might think they should believe, right? So that's why I'm saying, so that's masked in a way some of the things about secularization, so I want to complicate the questions we have about secularization in the first part of the 20th century and how the state church, established church, might have played into it. Let me give you one example of this from one letter before I finish. This is Miss Ethel Castle, a governess, writing into this society I've been writing about with her questions on Good Friday 1927, after she had become a member and was taking the society's healing waters. They have a healing ministry. She wrote, "I find myself in a difficult position and should be glad of advice and help. Today is Good Friday and I have not been to church. I belong to the Church of England and have been baptized and confirmed. Since I have taken your water, I find I'm getting help spiritually, and it's the sort of help I don't get by attending church. Now the question is, am I right in trusting to the water only? I hope I am, as though I go to church as a duty, and I love much of the service, I don't get the help spiritually. The second thing is this: I have a complete horror of death and the crucifixion, and of anything that makes me think of it. For years, I was completely unable to understand the necessity of so cruel a suffering and death as that suffered by our Lord. I do understand now, but still I don't like to think about it. Is that wrong?" So there's lots of letters like this, but this is a particularly great example. So my question, therefore, is to what extent the established church and dutiful attendance at the local parish, where the parish culture was so important in the English context, masked unbelief, heterodox belief, and so on. So it's not so much civic or civil religion, but I think the established church has played a particular role in presenting one kind of religious face, if you like, while something else entirely might go on in terms of belief and practice. Finally, let me leave you with an observation about the Church of England today from an anthropologist called Kate Fox. It's a story she tells, and then I'll stop talking. She says, "I remember eavesdropping on a conversation in my GP's waiting room, general practitioner's waiting room, doctor. A schoolgirl of about 12 or 13 was filling in some medical form or other with intermittent help from her mother. The daughter asked, 'Religion? What religion am I?' 'We're not any religion, are we, Mum?' 'No, we're not,' replied her mother. 'Just put C of E.' 'What's C of E?' asked the daughter. 'Church of England.' 'Is that a religion?' Yes, sort of. Well, no, not really. It's just what you put."
Thank you. When James Vernon asked me very kindly to join this conference, he recommended that I use my recent book, Christianity and Social Service, as a way into the subject, and I have taken his advice. When the book appeared, a reviewer in the London newspaper, The Independent, gave it a rather stark headline: "How the Welfare State Killed the Churches." In fact, the book was not originally conceived as a study of the welfare state, or the churches, or for that matter, Christian decline. In fact, the book was originally conceived as a study of the decline of charity and what I see as participatory institutional democracy. As it developed, however, a central theme of the book became the linkage between the expansion of government responsibility for social provision and the decline of Christian responsibility. The relationship between the government and people changed so dramatically in the 20th century that we may, like G.M. Young, see late Victorian England as an ancien regime. Translated into quantitative terms, less than 8% of gross national product was spent by government in 1900, and over 50% by 1960. Victorians held government in esteem, but expected little from it on social issues. In a national culture dominated by Christianity, they commonly believed that poverty was ineradicable, yet they sought its amelioration through voluntary service. A century later, most Britons believed poverty could be abolished, but that responsibility for welfare provision resided in the political process. In 1948, an opinion poll found that about 90% of people no longer thought that there was a role for charity in Britain. It's my view that the creation of the British welfare state undermined both the historic traditions of Christian charity and customs of associational citizenship, which Christianity had for centuries propelled. A lot has to do with sectarian rivalry, which was crucial to the flowering of associational charity in Britain. But in the early 20th century, overlapping religious agencies were increasingly seen as too patchy and precarious to address the level of social distress in an industrial economy under strain. That voluntary agencies were often sectarian, local, and run by women made them easy targets for those who favored a more comprehensive government solution to social reconstruction. The extension of the suffrage gave collectivism momentum, As such, it may be seen as an underlying long-term cause of Christian decline, for it prompted welfare legislation that eroded those voluntary traditions that gave meaning to Christianity for so many worshipers. To say that the state and Christianity proved less than companionable does not preclude other reasons for religious decline, from the effects of scientific rationalism to the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which Calum Brown has so eloquently talked about in his book, The Death of Christian Britain. But it does, in my view, add another dimension to the plethora of interpretations for the decline of Christianity, and I hope it will lead to some further research on this field. The characteristics of the state, national, materialist, and increasingly secular, and those of religion, parochial, sectarian, and otherworldly, make strange bedfellows in the modern world. The subject of social policy brings these distinctions into clearer focus. I find it quite interesting that across much of Europe, high levels of welfare and low levels of religious observance go together. A comparison with the United States is quite suggestive. The expansion of government had been in train since the 19th century, of course, but the comprehensive welfare legislation of the post-war years was, in my view, quite critical. It was the equivalent of urban renewal in social policy, which ravaged much of the historic fabric of the charitable services. For a start, the government nationalized over 1,000 voluntary hospitals, many of them religious institutions. As a result of welfare legislation, social policy shifted from the local to the national, from the religious to the secular, and the parish and the congregation bowed to the constituency. As suggested, the ministerial civil service state dislodged civic pluralism, whose foundations lay in Christian notions of individual responsibility. In other words, representative democracy supplants institutional democracy. One should not ignore the institutional failure of the churches as a cause of Christian decline, nor should we ignore the effects of the bombing of the 1940s during the war. My researches show that 15,000 ecclesiastical buildings were destroyed by bombing raids in 1940-41 and again in 1940. That's one ecclesiastical building for every parish in England and Wales. The Methodists suffered even more, most, I think, because they lost 2,600 churches out of 9,000. They were, of course, in urban areas. It was more a sign of exhaustion than of faith when the Church of England, battered by war and the bombing and financially troubled, resolved at the Lambeth Conference in 1948, quote, that the state is under the moral law of God and is intended by him to be an instrument for human welfare. As the Archbishop of York, Cyril Garbett, said in 1949, as a result of this Lambeth Conference dictate, the Church had abandoned its parochial traditions of social service. Obeisance to the omnicompetent state was an abdication of what may be seen as an historic responsibility, and it reflected a social and cultural transformation that had repercussions for Christianity that were arguably as great as any since the 18th century religious revival. In the belief that the state was fulfilling the law of Christ, Christian leaders failed to appreciate the consequences of endorsing a collectivist secular world without redemptive purpose. Salvation, after all, was not among the benefits of the Social Security Office. Collective provision eroded community religious life because charities linked so many families to churches and congregations. This was particularly true for women, who made up the majority of church and chapel goers and who carried out the bulk of the religious social work. The growing secular state culture and traditional Christian female culture were increasingly at odds. In the post-war world, as Calum Brown has observed in The Death of Christian Britain, women reshaped their lives, as he put it, within work, sexual relations, and new recreational opportunities. In their appeal to altruism and piety, visiting societies, mothers' meetings, Sunday schools, missionary associations had made denominational membership meaningful. They were, as it was often said in the 19th century, nurseries of religion. But the attractions of state benefits in a culture growing more materialist and national made such institutions seem increasingly dated and irrelevant. With the disappearance of these myriad societies, religious observance was bound to suffer. In the shifting post-war culture, Christianity was increasingly a private matter of individual conscience and not a call to social service. Rendering unto Caesar the things that traditionally were beyond Caesar's domain was particularly risky for the Church of England. for it bonded Anglicans to Whitehall, not to Lambeth Palace. By the mid-1960s, a book on the social work in the Church of England described Britain as a post-Christian culture. One is reminded of Tocqueville, who saw inevitable dangers to religious faith, quote, whenever the clergy take a public part in affairs. He concluded that if state religions were sometimes of momentary service to the interests of political power, they always sooner or later became, as he put it, fatal to the Church. The great currents of the 20th century were largely beyond the control of the Church of England. The collapse of parish-based charity was perhaps unavoidable, given the effects of war and Reconstruction, but rarely has a British institution so willingly participated in its own undoing. I'd like to conclude by emphasizing the issue of the state and democracy, which has been central to my research in recent years, and which may not be getting very much attention in this particular conference. The rethinking of politics after the collapse of world socialism in 1989 made me more sensitive to the relationship of voluntary societies and democracies in Britain. Sidney Webb observed in 1910 that a principal characteristic of 20th century society would be that it would consist only of government and of private citizens, and that the great ramshackle of voluntary institutions that constituted the fabric of the past would be replaced by the state. As he predicted, the state has largely replaced the voluntary sector in social provision. But at what cost? It is one of the great ironies of democracy that individuals are in many ways more impotent in an age of universal suffrage and cabinet government than their disenfranchised ancestors had been in an era of oligarchy, limited government, but a society richly endowed with voluntary campaigners. Arguably, there was more social connectedness in the age of Queen Victoria, with all its class distinctions and fear of representative democracy, than in post-war Britain with its New Jerusalem egalitarianism. Frank Field, the former minister for the welfare state in Blair's cabinet, Frank Field wrote a review of my book in The Spectator, and I was quite happy to see his opening line. The issues raised here could not be more important to the future of British democracy. He agreed with my proposition that Britain built a thriving civil society in the 19th century through the formation of countless voluntary, typically Christian organizations. And he agreed that this voluntary tradition had been undermined by the state in the 20th century at considerable cost to British democracy. Indeed, Frank Field went so far as to remark, in concluding his review, that Britain, once a highly decentralized voluntary system of welfare, had turned into, quote, one in which Stalin could have been proud, unquote. One might say, in context of our conference, that Britain had moved from the despotic state of Henry VIII to the, in the early modern period, to the benevolent despotic state of the late 20th century. Britain, of course, continues to be a nation of joiners, although nothing on the scale of the Victorians. This is a very important point. And their voluntary societies continue to give a voice to those who are excluded or feel excluded from the political nation, not least religious minorities. Today, this often means the growing number of Islamic and Muslim societies in Britain. In the past, it gave a voice to women and the working classes. For many 19th century charitable campaigners, the only votes they were ever able to cast were in voluntary institutions. These were the infamous voting charities. It is worth recalling that Christian voluntary societies teach the habits of association, mutual respect, negotiation, and compromise, which resulted in developing a particular character for citizenship. As Arthur Schlesinger observed about America's charitable campaigners, quote, in mastering the associative way, they mastered the democratic way. To Tocqueville, Weber, John Stuart Mill, among others, there was a connection between voluntarism and personality. As Mill put it, quote, without the habit of spontaneous voluntary action, citizens have their faculties only half developed, unquote. In a culture in which free associations prospered, individuals had to prove themselves resolute and responsible in their dealings with others. This was in sharp contrast to a statist culture, however benign, which encouraged docility and indecisiveness in its citizens. This issue fascinated the Victorians, who admired the democratic nature of self-governing institutions, but it faded in the 20th century with the growth of government and the decline of religion. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I am the token Scot here, I suppose actually in representative terms, I'm a quarter of the panel, and Scots only make up approximately 10% of the UK population, so perhaps Scots are overrepresented here. However, I'm not going to talk that much about Scotland. My remarks are connected. I hope you see the connections. I think postmodern approaches to the past are valuable only if the historian keeps in touch with the way in which, in Foucault's schema, discourse determines demography. Increasingly in my recent work, most of it unpublished, I'm turning my attention to demographic consequences of discourse. How cultural values, which are dominant in a society, lead people, either willingly or unwillingly, to order their lives according to discursive injunctions, to order their sex lives, when and in what manner they start their families, and in their moral outlook towards others. My comments that follow are based on this link between discourse and demography, and the role of religion in the state in leading the citizen to lead their lives in particular ways. I think religion is important, and I speak as somebody who is not associated with any religion. To many historians of 19th and 20th century Britain, particularly 20th century historians, those dealing with the 20th century, completely ignore religion. The Blackwell Companion to Britain in the 20th century, published I think 4 or 5 years ago, had, I think, in the region of about 25 chapters, and not one of them was on religion. Look up the index, and the Church of England gets 2 references. The British historian, indeed perhaps this applies to many historians, as a discipline are overwhelmingly secular in their personal lives, and as a result, increasingly secular in their outlook on the past. And I think this is important because it leads to some fundamental misunderstandings about the timing and the nature of the drift through pre-modernity to modernity, and then on, controversially, to post-modernity. The way in which we discuss religion needs to be constantly rewritten for the past, when the nature of what religion was in the past is so very different to what it is in the present. And imagining religion in the past, I think, is very hard for a generation who are dominated by a secular construction of what religion should be, that is separated from the state. The question of the impact of modernity upon religion in the state can be answered in a variety of ways. On the one hand, the role of religion may be considered in relation to the pre-modern nature of the state, certainly in relation to the link between the individual citizen and the state. And I think that is where religion is extremely important. That in the pre-modern and the modern periods, religion stands as a representative of the state, of the establishment, to the individual. In this regard, when thinking of religion in the state, I think there's a tremendous impulse to think local. Before the 20th century, indeed before the late 20th century, the citizen had the centre of his or her link to the state at local level, at the parish or at the borough level. And in that regard, the greatest and most intimate character of that link came through the parish church and its agents working through parish courts, the local landowners, through parish taxation, through parish charity, as Frank Pawhuska has been talking about, through moral control, and so on. Then, with modernisation between the 1830s and the 1930s, the so-called secularisation of the local state, which was a dominant theme of works on Victorian government, which I read as an undergraduate. The secularisation of the local state was, I think, pointedly nothing but. that the creation of new state-centred local agencies, poor law unions, parochial boards, school boards, district councils, even registrars of births, deaths and marriages, they were far from secularising British society, but because they actually perpetuated the religious state. In most cases, registrars of births, deaths and marriages were the parish clerk. And the membership of these organisations, most of them elected, tended to be church nominees, often elected on church tickets. If you were looking for a date when I think this parish state ended, for Scotland I would offer the year 1930, because in that year a whole raft of local organisations were abolished. School boards were abolished, district councils were abolished, the system of the poor relief was abolished. It took a few years to actually go. And the Church of Scotland was effectively disestablished by the Union of 1929 with United Free Church. In that event, there was a revolution in the relationship between the state and the citizen. For the first time, politicians had a new critical role in governing, certainly the Scottish citizen, and I think with some adjustment of the dates, the same can apply to England and Wales. It's from, in Scotland, 1930, for the first time, when politicians of the general parties, elected on general tickets, start to control the citizen in relation to poor relief, in relation to the provision of education, and in a number of other regards, including provision, for instance, of graveyards, until that was something else that was secularised in 1930. A different point, something I've sort of rehearsed already in this meeting, there is no one state religion. There's no one state religion in Great Britain and Ireland. Till 1921, we've got 3 states and 3 state churches. In 1920, Wales lost its state church, or rather, it lost, the Church of England lost Wales, to be precise. And indeed, in Welsh historians dealing with Wales, there's a tendency to see, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I think it may well be right, to see that act as very important to Welsh identity. That by becoming not the state church, the church in Wales, as it's called, became truly part of Welsh culture in its fight, inverted commas, with nonconformist-dominated Wales. One of the things that happens at the same time as disestablishment in Wales is that the Welsh bishops have meetings to talk about how collectively they must learn how to speak Welsh. It's a very, very significant cultural event. Scotland lost its state church in 1925, 1930, although there are some disillusioned people in the Church of Scotland who think it's still a state church. It's quite interesting. There's a schizophrenia within the Church of Scotland. Is it actually an established church or not? I would argue, till the cows come home, that it is not. So this leaves only England as being part of Britain with a state church. That leads on to my last observation. There is no one way in which an established church is established. Around Europe, every nation in Europe, I think I'm right in saying, at some point has had a state or established church. But the way in which each one was a state or established church was very individual. There is no one acid test for an established church. In the Church of England, bishops in the Lords is seen as an acid test, as James is quoting Lord Carey, an acid test of whether it's an established church or not. This doesn't apply, and has never applied to the Church of Scotland, for instance, which has never had bishops as of right in the church, in the House of Lords. although it has had clergy who have been and are bishops. But that's kind of a sort of nod in the direction of balancing out with the status of although interesting, the people who've been elected members of the House of Lords from the Church of Scotland have often been radicals and eccentrics rather than truly representative people. Nonetheless, the point I'm making here is that you can't transport one test of establishment from one country to another and expect that a church will pass that test. For many countries in Europe, it's the issue of taxation. And so you have the anomalous position in a country like Sweden, which is disestablished, I think in 2002, its church disestablished. There are still church taxes, which are essentially not compulsory on every citizen, but they're still part of the state system. Scotland has not had taxes since 1925, and even those were actually land taxes. So, establishment, I would say, is a very slippery concept. I completely avoided the difficult task which Ethan set of talking about a state religion, which I don't think we've actually spoken about, but which I think is an extremely difficult concept to pin down. Nonetheless, I think it's very important for historians to think very sharply about the relationship between religion and the state, and not necessarily think solely in terms of establishment. Think about other forms of relationship. And I'll finish on the great contradiction. England still got an established church. United States of America, broadly speaking, never had one. Which country has got the greatest influence of religion in government? I'll leave you to answer it.
Thank you. Thank you. Now my voice is officially going. All right. There's lots to talk about. I mean, I was sort of tracking two big issues that I was thinking were worth pushing. One is this notion of churches/religion being somewhere between civil society and the state, and that can play off of what we were talking about this morning. And the other obviously related issue is, what does it mean that the British state still has at least one established church, and what does it mean for the state to be explicitly in the religion business for this question of religion and the state? And what does it mean when they get out of the religion business for this question of religion and the state? But let me, in my role as moderator, push on Frank's argument about religion somewhere between state and civil society, and how the increase of state authority diminishes religion. And maybe it'll lead us to some dialogue between late modern and early modern. It struck me listening to you, Frank, that an almost identical argument has been made about the 17th century. That the provision of the Elizabethan Poor Laws took what was a voluntary system of local parish relief based on a medieval Catholic charitable, economy of salvation, made it into a requirement dictated by the state and overseen by the parish officers. The result was a certain amount of relief, hooray, fewer people starve, but an enormous collapse in charitable impulse, in associational life, in the religion of the community, in a sort of touchy-feely Anglican-y sort of a way, right? Is there a narrative we might want to pull between these things? Was there ever actually a sort of genuine religion as charity, community? I mean, one wonders, hearing these sort of parallel narratives, whether the sort of whether religion as something not part of a state apparatus was ever really as real as you might be making it out to be.
Well, I think they didn't see the religious revival coming of Wesley in 1603. The sectarian revival shaped so much of this religious culture of the time. I think the religious sense of 1851, Calum will correct me if I'm wrong, showed that there were basically a balance of people going to churches between the nonconformist sects and the Church of England.
In England, yes, it was almost
And
50.
by the end of the 19th century, I think the statistics would suggest that maybe the nonconformists were there in greater numbers than people, roughly the same still, was it?
No, the Church of England
Yeah.
grew relative to
Yeah.
nonconformity
Yeah.
in the Victorian period.
So when we're talking about a state church, we have to consider there's a lot of this religious activity taking place beyond it, of course. And the tensions between the nonconformists, over education in particular, were quite monumental through the 19th century. There still is religion in the state schools today, but it's a fig leaf of religion. And the religious teachers, of course, don't say much about religion in these classes these days.
Sorry, that's just not true.
Well, there's a lot of evidence from that in statistics. People have done surveys of school teachers.
Okay.
I've got some evidence for that. I'll show you sometime.
Particularly primary schools in Britain, there's a considerable religious contribution to the curriculum. Quite apart from what the legal requirements, which are different in Scotland and England and Wales. There's a very strong tradition of fairly traditional introduction of Christianity in infant classes in Britain, and that continues through. I would say without much change to primary 7. Secondary schools is where there's very much less, unless it's a church school, Church of England or a Catholic church particularly, and some of the newer academies. But I don't agree with your general proposition on that.
The multicultural ideal that's become very fashionable in the school system has undermined any specific Christian teaching. Now, they may be teaching some religious education there, but it's not specifically Christian. They're not reading the Bible to these students. My children went to a Church of England school, and the whole thing was multicultural.
Jane, would you like to jump in on this?
Well, I mean, I think just to evoke multiculturalism is actually not necessarily to say that there isn't specific Christian teaching. So I'm afraid I'm on Calum's side here. Yeah. I also don't want to get too anecdotal. I mean, I could tell you what happens in schools, well, but I don't want to be too anecdotal. I think the syllabus allows for specific teaching on a number of different religious areas, including Christianity. So, and it just so happens, actually, that many teachers know more about Christianity than they know about other religions. Actually, is the reality of the situation, I think. Mm-hmm.
But I guess the general point is that there's a sort of, there is hanging out there a posited religious experience that is somehow independent of authority, right? That is based somehow in civil society, which the state then comes in, takes over, and undermines. And I'm raising the question over whether that is in fact true. I, having written about the 16th century, that one can't talk about religion without first talking about the authorization of that religion, whether it's a state-sponsored church or not.
Yeah.
Brendan was trying to get in.
I'll just keep this brief, because I mean, I had exactly the same question from Frank as Ethan had, and it just, again, speaking as an early modernist, and
Hello. And thinking that, and again, I don't understand, I don't know much about Church of England, sort of moving forward, but it seems to me a focus on charity, at least coming from a 16th century perspective, that would seem to be the kind of religious element of that would be sort of would have been siphoned off, right? And that, I mean, there's nothing peculiarly sort of theologically demanded of the giving of charity in order to be in the Church of England, whereas, in a sort of penitential system based upon works, that is key. Christian charity, of course, is important, but it doesn't seem to be a foundationally important aspect of kind of religious, a religious litmus test. So I'm not sure why the welfare state taking care of charity somehow has a negative effect upon religion and sort of associational kind of...
Well, I would disagree that there's no religious impulse in this charitable endeavor. It's quite profound, particularly with the women. I was sick and you visited me. Yeah. You read the Bible. These people read the Bible.
It's not a matter of impulse.
What I think you're trapped into, what as we were saying earlier, that we have a secular outlook, and it's hard for us to read any religion into a very religious century like the 19th or the 17th. These people were profoundly religious, and their theology did encourage good works as perhaps not a sign of salvation, but an indication of salvation.
Right.
So you do not underestimate the religious zeal that's behind this. My first book, Women in Philanthropy in the 19th Century, is really a book about women in religion.
I guess, I'm just pushing Ethan's line where if the state is supposed to take on charity, right, as it does in the 16th century. I mean, one, in order just to be provocative, could say, well, finally, the 16th century logic has finally been worked out. Isn't that a good thing?
But in 1948.
So just another way to think of it over the longue durée.
Yeah, sure.
To put that in theological terms, I would say that when you're talking about a church, you could put the church-state relationship into theological terms by talking about the incarnation. So then if you emphasize the incarnation in your theology, i.e. that God became human, and there's a sort of fusion between that you can't separate the church off. I mean, that would be the difference between much of the Church of England and many of the dissenters and nonconformists, which is they want that there's an intention to be separate and voluntary, whereas much of the Church of England has floated along since the 16th century, shall we say, on this theological concept that you can marry these two things up. And I was just thinking about William Temple. I'd like to know what Frank thought about William Temple in the context of his argument, because, here he is, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury. He writes this extremely important book in 1942 or 3, just before he dies anyway, about religion and society, which is absolutely making this point that the two are fused, that you don't bring Christ into the world. Christ is already working in the world, and therefore a welfare state is the perfect working out of that, actually. So I just want to put what you said into vaguely theological language. No, not at all. Just different.
Calum.
What Frank has been saying has, of course, a very interesting context just at the moment of in America of healthcare reform. Mm-hmm. And I do have problems with Frank's hypothesis. I have grave problems on a number of levels. First of all, about his caricaturing of Victorian Christian charity, about the relations between social classes, which I think underlies his portrayal of that period. I'm one who would adhere to a rather more left-wing analysis of Victorian class structure and how the charitable system worked there. You pointed rightly to the sectarian system that tickets to get into a charity hospital in the 19th century depended in large part on knowing the minister, going to the church. There were lots of ways in which Victorian charity was really quite reprehensible. And certainly it did not solve the health problem of Victorian Britain, which I would put my hand up to and say was largely solved by the state, not by charity, by state intervention. On another level, I think there's a problem in portraying the rise of the welfare state as somehow. I think there's an implication in Frank's work that it's somehow undermining not just Christianity but the moral stature of the UK. I don't know if he's saying that, and you can come back and say I'm wrong. But if that is an implication, then I balk at that. I balk at the implication that a decline in Christian influence, church-going of Christendom, has somehow undermined the moral stature of the UK. I can go into reasons for that, and I think there's you can even empiricize it. I'm reminded of a different scholar, Christy Davis, who for the last 30 years has been trying to argue that the decline of religion in Britain is the cause of the rise in crime. Indeed, his work took on a new resonance when My Death of Christian Britain came out, because unbeknownst to me, he took the book and used the evidence from it to correlate with data on rising crime figures through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. However, his argument comes to a dead halt in the 90s where the crime figures fall, but church decline continues.
But that's the kind of argument, I was sort of in a way trying to say that in the first part of my remarks, which is that once you begin to talk about disestablishment or decline in some way, which disestablishment might point to or might not, then you begin to get this uncomfortable confusion with state religion and the role of the state in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the Lord Carey thing, right?
Comment?
Yeah,
Sorry,
you get your innings,
Yeah.
and then we'll get to the floor. Yeah.
Well, Calum's got a view that's quite traditional, conventional view that charity is always between classes. It's rich giving to poor. This has always been the historical scholarship on charity, and that's why we had a generation in the 1970s talked about social control nonstop. Well, my scholarship has tried to show that the bulk of charity is within classes. Middle-class people giving to middle-class people, and poor people giving to poor people. The whole history of working-class charity is something I've been working on for many years. You know, the sources are very rare, but I've put together quite a bit of information on this. So we shouldn't assume that this charitable world we're talking about is just a bunch of rich people handing out peppermints. And when you say that they didn't cure disease in the 19th century, well, they only had prognosis. There was no diagnosis. To expect to have a welfare state in the 19th century is like having a British moon landing in the 1930s. These people were doing the best they could in the circumstances of the day, looking after one another. And they did this to a large extent because of Christian motivation. As to America, I'm not one of these Christian fundamentalists. I'm an atheist. I'm just following my scholarship here. And what Americans make of my scholarship is their business.
Steve and then James.
So I have two different kinds of questions, which actually turns on what actually this panel might be. I mean, that is to say, it was defined as, I mean, my understanding is on the program, it says religion in the state, and I want to push much more heavily in two different ways about conceptualizing religion. One is, I mean, it struck me, I mean, Jane had this sort of very nice sort of statement, redefinition of secularization might be involved belonging and not believing. But I'm wondering whether that assumes a particular definition of religion, which was also sort of invited in the opposite sort of way by Ethan's paper. That is to say, it strikes me that one of the sort of big contestations is defining what actually religion might be. Because it strikes me that I mean, Jane's formulation strikes me as fairly Protestant, that it strikes me that a Catholic might, for example, just emphasize belonging as actually quintessentially part of the religious experience. So I guess what I'm sort of wondering is whether we could think much more theoretically and sort of straightforwardly about what one means by religion, and in fact whether how one defines religion is very much a sort of political act, much like the way we talked about how one defines the state as a political act. Obviously, so that's one sort of question. The other is, it struck me that this was a panel about religion, not about Christianity. And so I guess I wanted to sort of put this question to Frank a little bit. What happens if one thinks about the relationship between welfare and religiosity or belonging, and compare it to recent work in sociology and political science about Hamas and about the Islamic Republic in Iran? Because it does strike me in both of those cases, it's actually the state taking on welfare provisioning, which actually increased, I mean, all the evidence suggests it actually increases religiosity by a whole variety of different measures. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, what you're describing is something which is relatively, I take your comparisons to other European states, but I'm sort of wondering whether, in fact, what you're talking about is not a relationship between religion and the state, but a relationship between Christianity and the state.
I fear you've been reading too much sociology, Steve.
But let me get a couple more. Yeah, James, why don't you?
I was actually going to raise precisely that of Steve's first point, but I have two other ways of maybe opening up. And the first one is, I was really fascinated listening to you all that Christian practice outside of the UK didn't come up at all, and so it seemed to me like an obvious direction to go would be to think about the role of missionary work in relationship to the imperial state, the nature of the imperial state, and you know, I don't want to get into beating up Frank about the general thesis, because I'm a great admirer of your work generally, but it strikes me that you have a lot of Christian philanthropic work going on through missionaries in the colonial context where people are not feeling democratically empowered by it. But I think that the general shift that the general shift that you delineate is an absolutely fascinating and striking one, and something that we really have to grapple with seriously. I mean, there is a major, major transformation in terms of the relationship, in terms of who is engaged in welfare practice, and we need to have good explanations of that transformation. Then the other point that I was going to make is not about the church and the state so much as a sort of there being an official Christian religion of the state. And it strikes me that the longer I live outside of the UK, the more officially Christian it seems. And I mean, the official calendar, for instance, is a really interesting example of the blending of a Christian calendar with a secular calendar. And I think the same is actually true. I think, Calum, here's my turn to call you out as wrong. I think you're basically plain empirically wrong about the new civil officers of the 19th century. I think that religious groups, religious tickets for school board elections and poor law guardians happen in just a handful of very sectarian, divided cities like Liverpool, and you know, vast majority of people are being campaigning under party political labels. But anyway, the point is that there's this blending of the secular and the Christian in offices, in the calendar, it seems to me threaded all the way through the state in Britain. And then my final point is, I thought that we would get to the Salman Rushdie affair, or at least to the growth of immigrant church groups post 45. The Rushdie affair to me was the unmasking of that official Christian religion in the British state.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in, this notion of the blending of the secular and the religious, and the way in which that blending tends to the benefit of the state, it tends to the increase of state power, the support of state power, strikes me as a key theme in British history right from the Reformation onwards, probably before as well. But you're right, that notion that you would take people's supposedly internal spiritual impulses and you would turn them outwards, right, and direct that turning outwards in certain authorized, established ways, right? Sometimes happens through formal coercive measures like recusancy acts, right? You must come to church, you must pay your tithes, and so forth. Sometimes it happens through calendars that list, 10 weeks, the 10th Sunday after Michaelmas as like a normal way of reckoning time. And the Oxbridge calendar, term calendars still represent this, right? And it strikes me that interrelation belies a sort of spirituality, a religion that is logically antecedent to the state, authorization, the exercise of power in the state. And so that's what I was trying to suggest, is that lots and lots of people claim religious motivations for lots and lots of things, right? Lots of people claim that I am acting in my way out of conscience, right? And you, the state, shouldn't touch it. And when the state moves in to critique or to bend conscience, all sorts of bad things happen, right? But it strikes me that maneuver to conscience, right, is always already a claim about a certain sort of power, right? That there is no conscience that is not already acting in the world. And in a British context, anyway, I think it's historically, sort of empirically verifiable that the state is always a sort of prime mover in doing that directing. And Calum's work on gender is sort of central to this, right? That in the 20th century, okay, it's about the ways in which gender gets generated through the state that then shapes people's experiences of religion. That's different than a 16th century model when it's about the sort of church fabric that you encounter. But this is still sort of church power. That would be my take on this. Did that stop all conversation dead?
Just not quite sure where to go with it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay.
Can you say 2 or 3 sentences more, actually? That would be really helpful. Sorry to make your voice.
Yes. I'm trying to suggest that religion upholds state power, right, in all sorts of powerful ways, and that a discussion of religion in the state that's about secularization, that's about the state opposing religion and somehow taking over religious space, right, is missing the fact that these things have always been intertwined in different historically specific ways, and that most of the time anyway, that religion, that spirituality is acting to uphold state power rather than to undermine it.
Well, in some ways, this happens in the fact that the state is seen in a kind of negative light, one could argue, in the 18th and 19th centuries vis-a-vis the established church or Christian church. When you think about the long and contentious history of nonconformist, and need I mention Jews and others who certainly were not. I mean, there were areas in which they could not become state officials, right? I mean, that's just a simple fact that's out there. Not to mention what is going on in the, dare I say, the empire closer to home, where there are a whole lot of Catholics, and then in other parts of the world where it is the political culture through missionaries, but then it's also certain ways in which, you know, the imagination of whether it's the Jamaican sort of worker or, you know, slave, or it's someone working in British India, just thinking about the way in which a Christian calendar is organized and the state representatives there. So I actually think, I think we could sort of kind of open it up to think about the way that we were, I thought, very complex about thinking about the state this morning, thinking about religion in this sort of complex way. And it seems that, you know, maybe we have more disagreements and there's more tension here than there was this morning. But I think it's really important to think theoretically and in terms of political culture and the economy about what a language of religiosity gave to Britain. I mean, it's just absolutely key to the work that people do in the early modern period, I think. And I think modernists are a bit struck by this kind of some of the tensions that are being sort of people are talking about here, these disagreements. So you know, maybe I'd like to hear more about that sort of the complexity of religion and the power dynamics there, because let's face it, I mean, even for Jews who we know had a certain financial power if they were involved in the London Stock Exchange, they didn't have other forms of power. Wealthy Jewish men, you know, circa 1802, 1810, 1835. I mean, there are not a lot of them, but sorry.
Yeah. Well, oh, I'm sorry. Was there someone? Yeah.
I've been interested recently trying to think about ideas of national sin and how those sorts of discourses are interesting in terms of, in some ways, acting almost as a sort of reverse sovereignty, where people feel responsible for the actions of Parliament, and you seem to see there the instincts I think you were suggesting for state action, because there is almost an anxiety that state complicity in sins devolves through religious conscience on members of the country, which in the sort of specific self-interest example that I've been looking at was through looking at anti-slavery, of this sort of mass popular mobilization, which was certainly very concerned and had a feeling that Parliament sanction for something devolved on their eternal souls, as well as sort of national prosperity through a providential means. But it seems to me those discourses of national sin very much sort of almost create an impetus for state action.
Yeah, I saw another hand. Yeah.
Wanted to raise the issue of Islamic and Hamas, and actually just this question that there is this difference between welfare and charity, and the state can give welfare or charity. And I don't think what's happening in Iran is necessarily that there is a welfare state, but maybe there is a charity state. So if you keep on giving charity, it's not citizenship, it's not rights, it's not opportunity. But if you're giving welfare, that's something else. I just wanted to point to that.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that Steve was talking a little bit about, and sort of an idea of what religion and belonging is. And I'm thinking actually of points of pressure in the 16th century, because that's what I do, between the state and religion specifically. And as Professor Shagan said, I think this actually has to do with matters of conscience as well as matters of behavior, which I think is an interesting tension, right? And that's something that's sort of belonging and believing we can sort of look at there. And I'm thinking in this case of subscription. The 3 articles in 1583 in which they say not only will they use the Book of Common Prayer, but there's nothing in the Book of Common Prayer contrary to God's word. And this causes huge upsets, right? And people protest and send in petitions and say, I promise that I'll use the Book of Common Prayer and I won't preach anything else in my church, but I can't promise in good conscience that I believe this. And I think that there are these moments in which there's an attempted intervention into conscience. And I wonder if we see a change in that over the course of the time that we're talking about, and whether there becomes a sort of more integrated line or a more divided line between those things. Does that become more acceptable or less acceptable? And does it fluctuate? And what does that tell us about the state? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
Could you just say the last bit again?
I'll try. That there is a relationship between when the state asks for matters of simple conformity and when the state asks for matters of conscience. And this occurs throughout our period that we're all talking about broadly. And I'm wondering if we could try to map that a little bit, which would maybe help us to understand this relationship between religion and the state and the church slightly, whether this becomes more acceptable to demand conscience, less acceptable, or does it happen in times of pressure? Is this something that the state turns to when the state is feeling endangered? Not that the state can feel, as we all discovered this morning, but when people who are in charge of the state perhaps feel pressured.
Yeah. Well, I'm just struck by the ways in which, thank you, Steve, because I think that in a way that the sort of Catholic element that the Church of England had was that you could just belong, actually, which is in a way what you're speaking to. So this believing thing is the Protestant element that gets brought in, and I think regardless of the 17th century, which Ethan could talk about the middle of the 17th century if you like, and how that might relate to the last question, it seems to me that a key moment in shifting all of this stuff is actually the 19th century, when the Church of England starts to develop church parties. Once you get the Evangelical Revival and the Anglo-Catholic Oxford movement, then you begin to get, I think, much more sort of pressure that you have to believe in a certain way or you have to belong in a certain way, and a sort of easiness about maybe you could go to the Methodist chapel in the evenings and you might go to your local parish church in the mornings. That kind of easiness of sort of just like drifting along and belonging becomes less possible in certain contexts, I think. So I think church party in the 19th century is quite a pivotal moment from the church's side. But clearly I'm not talking about the state side.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
I mean, how can we integrate that into a narrative of the state when, I mean, clearly in the 16th century, the state is intervening actively in people's moral lives, right? In the 20th century, of course, the state is also intervening actively in people's moral lives, but one might take that no longer to be religious. On the other hand, one might not, because the state in England, anyway, is still, after all, in the church business, uniquely among Western democracies, and the nature of their intervention might appear in some ways religious.
Can I have a stab at one of the presumptions underlying your statement, and perhaps in the room, the notion that things that the state are doing are because of an established church? And I think that's a canard that needs to be tackled. The vast bulk of what the state is doing in relation to religion, in support of religion, is not actually got anything to do with the Church of England or the Church of Scotland or the Church of Ireland. It's in the 19th and 20th century. It's to do with pressure from the temperance movement. It's to do with pressure from the Sabbatarians. One of the least remembered things about English religious history is the raft of acts of Parliament that were passed in the late 1920s and early 1930s in support of Sabbatarianism in England, which didn't apply to Scotland. And which were not effectively undone until the 1994 Act on. There's a lot of ways in which the church is entering. The state is entering into the religious sphere in the 19th and 20th century, which is actually as a result of pressure groups, as a result of sorry to use that word again. Discourses finally leading to legislative support of certain positions in society, and I think it is wrong to constantly question religious aspects of state policy, interrogate it purely in terms of what the Church of England is doing. The Church of England and parts of the parties in the Church of England may well have an influence on it, but things are not being done because of an established church. So I just take.
Sorry, I wasn't saying that. I was talking about the believing and belonging point, not this other point. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I wasn't. I wasn't talking about your narrative, but I thought there was an underlying notion going around the room. Can I just come back? I've been puzzling for the last 10 minutes in silence over what James's comment about religious influence in contemporary Britain. Which I just don't buy. Religious calendar, how is this influencing people's daily lives?
Depends where you are, Calum.
Yeah, I mean, okay, it divides up the legal year. Okay, some universities still use Martinmas and what have you. So what? There has to be some acid tests about religiosity. If Hugh MacLeod were here, his acid test of religiosity and everything he writes is church. Do people go to church or not? And that goes also for Steve Bruce. I mean, Steve is a purist. He says if you can't count them, they don't exist. Right? So and the way you can count them is if they go through the door, right, of a church. Now, I'm not a purist like that, but I do have some sympathy. There's got to be something tangible, which the historian has got to be able to feel. And that tangibility can include reflexivity to discourse. I'm not got a problem with that. But I don't see the survival of a religious calendar structuring certain aspects of civil life as a religious influence. I really do not. I mean, I think that would be taking Grace Davies' notion of a memory mutates to an extreme. I actually don't buy Grace Davies' thesis, nor does Steve. I don't know if some of you know about Steve, but Steve Bruce is the arch exponent of secularization theory, who argues both for Britain and the United States that secularization is inevitable and unstoppable. And that he also argues that the United States is essentially a secular society. Not many sociologists agree with him at the moment, but he's sticking to
Not many historians either, Calum.
he's sticking to his guns. Now. So I'm interested if James wants to come back. And
happily, I have the microphone.
I know. I actually saw you making a very good left wing move to pick it up.
Look, my point, I guess, what I'm trying to get here is a little bit of clarity in terms of this relationship between religion and the state. Okay, so my point. This is what I'm going to suggest. Clearly, we have to have an account of how the state takes on increasingly secular forms. And yet, clearly, we have to acknowledge that the state is not an entirely secular beast, even in contemporary Britain. Okay, so for me, it's a question of trying to parse out that blending of the secular and the officially Christian in terms of the operation of the state. And I think that there are a whole range of ways in which you can see that. You were talking about education with Frank earlier, and I think that's obviously a key place in which you can talk about the official Christian presence of the state. The other point that I wanted to make, and this sort of comes back to the discussion this morning, and rehearses a conversation in my graduate class this week. In many ways, it seems to me, we look for the. I mean, just as the secularization stories you know, absurdly simple, so is that same story projected onto the state. So what I would suggest is that what happens particularly in the 19th century, is that you have this enormous contest about who has responsibility for moral government. And there are a whole range of agencies that are engaged in that process of the moral government of the population. And some of them are religious groups and some of them are secular groups. And it seems to me that's the contest that has been going on for the past 2 centuries. Now, at what point religious groups seek to have primary responsibility for moral government, I think it's a great historical question, but I suspect it's something way back in what you call this early modernity thing that, you know, gets a bit fluid for me. But for me, those are the 2 historical questions that we have to ask. When is it that the tipping point comes in terms of the blending of religion and the state, and when's the tipping point in terms of who has primary responsibility for the moral government of the population?
Well, I'm not precisely going to reply to any of those, but of course, either of those things. But I'm going. What I feel people questing after, and what I think your initial points, James, sort of directed me towards was, in what sense, in a fuzzy sense even, is there a mindset in Britain, if you like, about the relationship between church or indeed religion and state, which might still continue to exist despite all these many official loosenings of ties and despite secularization. So you called it an official Christian religion. And I wonder what is going to happen in relationship to other religions now. Let me give you 2 examples about this. One is, will there be a constitutional crisis if Prince Charles, when he becomes king, insists on being defender of faiths? And there is a secret committee in the Church of England working on this now, by the way. It's no longer secret because I've just told you all about it. I'm not on it. So that's one of those questions. The second thing is about human rights, actually. Human rights legislation, because what's been really interesting in the last few years is that the state has been completely soft, not only on the churches, but on all religions with regard to their being exempt from the Human Rights Act, about basically women's rights and gay rights. I mean, it's just, and you talk to a human rights lawyer, and because female priests are exempt from the Sex Discrimination Act. How nice for us. I've never been employed by the church, but on behalf of my sisters, I am concerned about this. And I've talked to various human rights lawyers to see if we can do something about this, and they consistently say, wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. So this kind of official, this sort of protected status that the Church of England enjoyed for so long, that is going in many, many, many ways, both officially and unofficially. But in what ways are other religious groups, including other Christian groups, but other faiths, moving into that space and in some ways enjoying it because we have what you called an official Christian religion, but I want to now say it's an official state plus religion mindset? So I wasn't quite answering your questions, but it was me fermenting about what you'd said earlier. I mean, fermenting rather than fomenting. Yeah.
It strikes me as funny how modern this discussion is.
Sorry.
In contrast, I mean, and this is in part, I think, a representation of the panel, but it's also in part, I think, a representation of the issue, in which it would seem that the early modern period is very easy, right? And that the late modern period, we seem to have, or let me put it this way, that there seems to be an easy narrative for which there is a telos, which is secularization. And the question then is, how secular or not is it, and when exactly does that happen? And I want to posit for you that frame of thinking about religion and the state through the lens of secularization might not be the most interesting way to address the question of religion and the state, and that by doing that, that's what's making us talk about the late modern period so much. Right.
I do resist the allegation that talking about religion in the modern period is made easy by a narrative on secularization. All my work has been to contest that narrative.
That's why it's so easy.
But it's a contested narrative. I mean, almost 80% of my Death of Christian Britain book is not about the 1960s. It's actually about the period 1800 to 1960 and about the continued dominance of religion in British culture. It's about the survival of hegemony of Christianity in people's lives. It's not about the state enforcing this. It's about its survival and mutation within British Christian culture, particularly under an evangelical model. It's a
Still believe in secularization.
Right.
Yeah, but hang on.
I didn't mean that. All I meant was that it's
but not an easy
tipping point. When we do this tipping point discussion, is what leads us into this modern frame.
Yeah. James is throwing grenades from the back of the terracing.
Someone's going to take this away from me.
Steve Pincus. Give it to Steve.
Yeah, there's now an emerging consensus amongst social historians that if you're looking for a period, it's the 1960s. Those of you who haven't looked at Hugh MacLeod's book, The Religious Crisis of the 1960s, needs to do that, because it's international focus covering England, Western Europe, Canada, United States, Australasia. Misses Scotland out quite deliberately. I won't say why. In that book, he talks on page 1 that the 1960s represented a rupture in Christendom, as severe as the Reformation. The tail end of the book talks about the undermining of Christendom in those countries in the 1960s. It's a very sophisticated study, and I would urge you to have a look at it. Where I disagree with Hugh MacLeod is that he sees the undermining of Christendom as being fostered particularly by liberal Christianity in the 1960s. He sees liberal Christianity as battling particularly from the 1920s with an agenda across a wide sweep of issues, which comes to fruition in the 1960s. And I have problems with that, and I've engaged with him with it. I think there are other causes. And I think one of the things that he underestimates is the conservative Christian reaction to what happened in the 1960s, which still, to this day, in Western Europe and in the United States, is the motivating force behind conservative Christianity. It's a reaction to the 1960s. I mean, I think he actually says that what went on in places like Berkeley in the 1960s is one of the reasons why there was an evangelical political reaction in North America.
You need the microphone.
Odd idea that this is about secularization at all. I mean, if the result of this 1960s, and I like that you compare it to the Reformation, which makes me think that it's actually a religious event. But if what the 1960s produce is an entirely new and in a sense one of the most powerful Christian structures, political structures that we've seen for I think since I don't know when, since the kind of the rise of liberal Protestantism, then it's an odd thing to think that this is actually secularization. I don't know what to call it particularly. It seems to me the Stephen Bruce model misses virtually everything that's interesting about what people do with religion, whether they believe in it, whether they go to church or not. Seems to me a kind of one marker of something. It certainly tells us something, right? But it's not clear to me that what exactly it tells us. But as a story about secularization, I think in some ways your story, the 1960s story, and I haven't read Hugh MacLeod's book, but Hugh MacLeod's book sounds like it's doing the final demolishing job on thinking about secularization as really as a useful heuristic for understanding how religion perdures, how religion transforms itself, how religion interacts with states, how religion imagines itself in new political contexts. So I'm not sure what we get out of secularization if what you're saying is that the 1960s produce some of the great new political Christianities of the late 20th century.
We haven't said much about the 18th century, so I'll do my bit here.
Steve, I'm sorry, I jumped in front of you. My enthusiasm.
Or rather, going back to your anti-slavery comment earlier, which I think is very, very important. Is it the case that we can think of the 18th century, and particularly perhaps the Scottish Enlightenment, as a place where Christianity reimagines itself? And let me remind you, the moderate party's absolutely central role in covering for Hume protecting Smith, giving a network for both of them, right? And then on to Boyd Hilton's thesis about Christian political economy, Christian Malthusianism, right? What does that do to our story? How does that complicate the secularization narrative?
Right, well, it implies that Christianity is always reinventing itself. That's what Christianity does. It's a constant reform movement, and it's reinventing itself in a modernist, I shouldn't say in a modern context, specifically in regards to the great new formation of modernity, the civil state. Right? So, again, it strikes me that the discussion, as long as the discussion revolves around secularization rather than Christian reinvention, right, we're going to always end up, focused on tipping points rather than focused onto the internal dynamics of any given time and place and the ways in which religion functions to uphold certain forms of state power while the state might tend to undermine certain forms of religiosity. I mean, this is a dialectical relationship that, is underway in all these periods. I'm not opposing change over time. There's tons of change over time. But I think a linear version of that produces as many problems as it solves.
Can I just say there are sociologists who've talked about secularization not in that linear way, such as David Martin. Yeah. Spiral.
And it's also worth saying that historians are not totally obsessed with secularization. There's other things going on. But can I just reassert some basic fundamental empirical information about religion in Western Europe? Church attendance, church membership, baptism, religious marriage collapse from the mid-1960s in Europe and are continuing to collapse. They're going down in a straight line decline. Now, that is used by Steve Bruce, for example, as unequivocal evidence that secularization is on a track to make Europe a completely secular continent. I 80% agree with Steve in the importance of reading that data that way. I do think there are other interesting stories. I do not accept that this process is inevitable. I think it's very dangerous for any historian to predict the future. In defense of Hugh MacLeod, and please can you pass on, Jane, that I am defending Hugh MacLeod. Hugh MacLeod says that whilst his book covers all the countries aforementioned with a very similar story, he says in 1972, something happens to put the United States on a different trajectory. The United States departs from the European model of secularization. That the statistics of religious adherence and all the others do not continue to collapse in the European model. So he says, and I totally agree with him, something happens in the early 1970s to put the United States on a different trajectory. So the story is a complex one. It is not a simple one on secularization. Talking about what secularization is, when it takes place, how we can understand it, is meat and drink. And there's no single way to do it. To read levels of it, the establishment is one way. Religious belonging is another way. Religious believing, the use of opinion polls is another. But also, can I stick up again for looking at discursive dominance in society? It is important to look at the way in which people's cultural behavior is affected by Christian understandings, even if they are not necessarily members of a church or go to church or even actually sign the box on a census form saying that they are Christian.
Can I say something? Please. There seems to be a predisposition in the conference to be taken in by sociologists. Just look at what they've given us. Years ago, it was all about urban growth. Christianity couldn't survive in an urban environment. What was next? They give us secularization theory. They've given us modernization theory. Does anybody believe in modernization theory here anymore? What's next? Believing, not belonging? That'll drop too. We need some real serious historical scholarship here, not about a bunch of namby-pamby ideas thrown up by sociologists who never go to a library.
What strikes me as interesting is that the comments all seem to go back to the question of religion, belief, secularization, and don't seem to go back to the question of the state. Right? And I find that interesting And I wonder whether it's because this panel is a bad idea, right? That was my initial intervention, right? My initial intervention was, surely it's stupid to have this panel on religion and the state, because religion is that uncreated internal part of ourselves that is not subject to external jurisdiction, and this is just a secular humanist thing. And it's almost like we're proving that true, in the sense that everyone wants to talk about religion in terms of when and how and why religion is the motivating factor that structures people's lives. And we never get back to the state as the sort of key institution channeling power in modernity and how religion might relate to it. And it strikes me that whether or not someone believes, they might still have the question of religion in the state might still profoundly influence their lives. Whether the state has an official religion, the question of religion in the state might still profoundly influence people's lives.
I utterly believe the importance of studying the state and religion, utterly believe. And I believe that something very major happened between, say, 1780 and 1820 to transform the nature of the relationship between the state and religion. The single most important thing to that change was not secularization. It was the rise of evangelicalism. Whilst many evangelicals said the state must be on the side of religion, ultimately the move from the concept of religion as the imposition of discipline upon people and the calling upon the civil magistrate to support in the Lutheran 12 Kingdoms idea, which really dominates much of Protestant Europe, down to the early 19th century. When that goes, it goes not because of secularization, but because evangelicals are saying it's down to the individual. It's down to the individual to confess and profess. And that is the ultimate undermining of confidence that the state should be the vehicle for the imposition of religion upon the people.
Steve, and then Tom Brady for a non-British perspective on the matter.
I guess I wanted to say, I mean, there are a lot of things I wanted to say. One was, I think Frank and I should have a conversation about what actually goes on in social science departments, because I have a rather different view of this.
This theory on religion. Some of it's interesting, but it doesn't seem to last very long. And as historians, we seem to need some ideas superimposed on the evidence.
Let me just sort of, this is a separate conversation. I don't want to have that right now. What I do want to sort of have a conversation about is that it strikes me that, and this was sort of very clear about what was going on in the panel. I think your observation is right, Ethan, that there's a difference between what's going on in the early modern period and what's going on in the modern period. And for all of the disagreements among the three modernists on the panel, there was a willingness and an interest to engage at a sort of theoretical level, even, you know, whatever you want to say. And there's radical disagreement, but talking about what secularization might mean, how one might think about it in different sorts of ways. The discussion in the early modern period is flat, flat, flat. It deals with the 1950s conception of secularization that is extremely fat, extremely unsophisticated. And it strikes me that the reason why there isn't an interesting discussion about, for example, church parties and the way that I think Frederick sort of raises, but I think you could tell the same sort of story that Jane was suggesting for the 19th century about the late 17th and early 18th century. It strikes me as almost impossible to understand the Sacheverell affair without thinking about that. That one needs to sort of think about it for the early modern period, and I think one could take this story back to actually sort of re-inject. I mean, I don't care whether it comes from sociology, but just sort of hard thinking about the ways in which the relationship between religion and the state are being reformulated, discussed in a variety of ways straight through the early modern period. And because of the ridiculously simplistic notions of rejecting any discussion of sort of secularization because we know people are still going to church, we know people still believe, is a way of sort of occluding discussions of religious change. And you see this in Stephen Taylor's work, you see this in Jonathan Clark's work. I mean, it has made the study of religion in the 18th century, I mean, before Jane's stuff, really boring. And it strikes me. And it does strike me that it's because of the lack of sophistication of early modern scholarship that has led to an unsophisticated. Now, I'm not advocating any kind of teleological story. I'm advocating just simply reconceptualizing the basic terms. We're still in the early modern period rehearsing, reenacting, making new moves of a debate that was sort of based on a series of assumptions which were bequeathed to us in the 1950s and 1960s.
Why is the solution to that a more sophisticated version of secularization theory?
I'm saying that what this discussion, what this debate about, about disagreeing about what secularization might or might not mean was actually a discussion. It was an interesting, and I don't know anything, I can't evaluate this debate, but it was an interesting discussion of thinking about what sort of terms one should be having this discussion. That kind of theoretical sophistication has been sadly lacking in the early modern discussion of religion, with a very few couple of exceptions. I actually think Peter is one of the people who does have a sophisticated, and it's really too bad that he's not here.
No, absolutely. You can
buying his plane ticket for me.
You can give that to Tom in the back, and while you're doing that, I'll just say it's not clear to me then why there is extraordinarily sophisticated scholarship on the relationship between religion and the state in the early modern period. It's scholarship that, from the work of Pat Collinson sort of onwards, right? It's at heart dealing with a series of issues that are not concerned with secularization and that are not concerned with the advent of modernity. There is a different series of questions that are at stake in that scholarship. I think that literature is, the literature on Puritanism and the literature on literature on the relationship, but on the politicization of Puritanism in the Revolution, right? That those are extraordinarily sophisticated literatures dealing precisely with the issue of the relationship between the state as a maker of religion and the state as a reflection of religion, and how the individual, the sort of new phenomena of a bounded Protestant individual, might or might not fit into the body of the state, right? All of Pat Collinson's work about Puritanism is precisely at the nexus of this problem that Puritans imagine themselves to be both members of and leaders of a national church and are of a religion which would reject any necessity of a national church at all, right? And so the negotiation of that problem leads Puritans into this odd dual existence, both as the most radical revolutionaries, the sort of first modern individuals in conflict with, sort of radically deracinated individuals, and as the great upholders of campaigns for moral order and the sort of authorities that demand that the state persecute all manner of moral misbehavior, right? That's what's the heart of the early modern debate on religion and the state. None of that has to do with secularization. None of that has to do with modernity, except insofar as one might posit, again, a sort of an old vision of the sort of individual against the world. It strikes me that if one carries those questions forward, you might get as interesting a discussion as if you carry modern preoccupations with secularization backwards.
Oh, I completely disagree.
But I would perhaps want to throw in a third thing, and I won't say this for long because I know Tom wants to speak, which would be if you carried it outwards in the 19th century into the empire, I think you get a more interesting and nuanced thing. And I'm really sorry we haven't done that. And I almost had a little section in my comments about that, because there's obviously a massive historiographical debate about how much missionaries do the work of colonists. But other people here know more about that than I do. But I think that's actually, I would venture to suggest that's where you might get the really interesting textured discussion that you sort of want us to have that we haven't had, and I'm so sorry.
Tom.
Thank you. I am an interloper here. And one of the reasons I came is because although I'm a retired gentleman of leisure from this faculty, I have great interest in the restoration of the position of the British histories in our faculty. And I think they have a wonderful future. But the thing that struck me most about what I've heard today is I've never heard fall one phrase, civil religion. And
twice, Tom.
Did you? I'm sorry. My hearing isn't what it once was. And civil religion, of course, refers often to pacts of collaboration and mutual legitimation between states and religious bodies, and not only Christian ones, by the way, certainly not in the United States. And there's no such thing, of course, as religion in general or Christianity in general. There's the religion of somebody, somebodies, Christian or not. Now, I have a notion or a suspicion that some of the decline of the religious legitimacy of religious institutions in Europe has to do with its links to the state and the decline of state legitimacy. And I want to tell a story which is completely over the top, but it sort of illustrates I won't say the point, but the possibility. When Alexis de Tocqueville went to Ireland in 1835, I think, he went around the country, and there not being the sort of hotels he would have lived in Europe, in European cities, he lodged with clergymen, because often you could expect to get a glass of, I don't know about decent wine, but at least wine at a clergyman's table. And one of the clergymen he stayed with was Monsignor Kinsella, who was the Roman Catholic Bishop of Kilkenny. And he asked the Monsignor, who was trained in a French seminary, of course, this is only a generation after the founding of Maynooth in 1795, about why do you reject the plans or the proposals that the Catholic clergy be put on the public expense, that is to say that they be salaried, because it had no property, of course, by the British state. And he said, if we would accept any such offer, it would utterly destroy the trust of the people in us. Now, if you come forward to the 1960s and later and look at the position of the Roman Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland and what is happening to it now, you see a situation which can, in my mind, at least partly be attributed to its devil's pact, as it were, with the Republican state. It's just a suggestion.
I think that suggestion sounds like the last word. Thank you very much to our panelists.